I've got to write your name because I that's okay. I'm spelling What's your name? McDermott. MC, capital DERMOTT. And you could put kitty in parentheses because
yes, I know.
That other he's going to go.
Hey, no,
Hi.
Been back?
Yes, I'm wearing a mask. I'm over it.
I brought my mask too. This whole thing is what I want to try. I'm so excited. Well,
Volunteer.
You need to see that. I mean, it's with the pneumonia.
Oh, no.
Are you back out of the world? You're not back in the world yet.
No, I'm not back in the world. So I can hear a little bit.
okay. And we talk as
So were you in Israel for there? Like?
No, I
know they don't.
Yes, because I would love to come to it. I used to so do I. But I was,
because they have left,
well, I don't drive,
I hope they have them again soon.
Well, I understand.
Yeah. Okay, good to see you. Yes.
Do you know what is the book? That reference to Todd-Peters book?
You could tell
I know a little bit about it. It's good.
I'm anxious to, I'm anxious to
I'm
get
sure,
it.
I mean, she'll talk about it.
Yeah. Oh, the book? Was that good?
Hi, it's Dan Fink. Nice to meet you. No, yeah. Thank you for coming out. Where's home? Where? My mom's in Cathedral.
you want to take a picture of it? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't this handy? Oh, I know. Don't get your pen. This is good. I've got it on my phone.
Yeah.
Okay.
You got some
And that's one.
first snow of the year?
And I got it on Amazon and it came in one day.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, that's a thing.
That just
That's a good way to do it.
I know.
I did too.
What is it called?
I was born president here. I mean, probably 25 years ago. A long time ago.
Oh, there it is. Maybe that's her name.
Yeah, I was born president and I've been active. No, I grew up mostly on but I've been here almost 30 years. So I am sort of from Idaho now. Not originally.
Is that the name of the book?
Do you
No, and that's going to be in February. Okay. But the speakers tonight. So this one. Oh, wait a minute.
Well, maybe put it up there so that you want to put it up
You didn't bring books to sell?
Women.
No, and you know what people ask?
Women. Yeah, that's the name of the book. And it's a progressive Christian argument for reproductive justice.
Yeah.
Christian? Yeah. Christian.
Well, I know.
Well, it's easy for me, I'm reading it.
It came the next day.
A progressive Christian argument for reproductive justice.
But the local bookstore,
Oh, yeah, oh, you're going to go.
they're good figures.
Yeah, write it all out.
And her name
Is Rebecca, E-C-C-A, Todd, Peters,
Okay.
Now, all of these reasons can draw. Oh, again, she's coming back to talk about
Yes, and this is
No, this is in February. It's February. Back here. This saying the next Can We Talk event is scheduled for February. We would
When did you
appreciate
get in?
feedback on that.
progressive. Is that going to be progressive Christian Jewish perspective?
Unfortunately. Wow. I should take a picture of that too.
I was in Miami.
It's you who would do it.
You're right.
I came through Denver. I'm often fine.
show going. It's called the God Squad. And it was Rabbi Mark Ellen and Monsignor Tom Hartman, best of friends, discussing topics. All morning long, only in New York.
And see, I told you in the past, before that, we to a couple of studies. Oh, and so I ended up being
Oh God, that's so
now
funny.
remember, I know what.
Right.
When you're with people who know nothing,
Well,
it's okay. Sometimes it's
well, no. It's like when he asked me, she said, "You want to go to the casino for lunch?" I said, "One." And she said, "We're going to have a speaker." She said, "Would you?" Anyway, all rabbis are teachers. Rabbi means teacher. It's teacher. But I'm a New Yorker, you know. I know my friends. But if you've never stories. And good stories. Yes, and that's Mark, and that's Rabbi. Oh, well, that's fine. I'm getting back to what you were saying earlier. Oh, yeah. Oh. See, I'm kind of on it. So it's like, and I said, how do I line my well, you're not going to let it go. No, because it was cute. So I just ignored it. That's just not talking to myself. Because if you don't have exposure, I wouldn't say that. If you don't have exposure, you don't have exposure. And I felt very blessed. I had so many kids. Well, where is the Jewish temple? Well, it was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed. How many others of yours? But obviously they don't like history. No. So you look at this is all history. Well, they said, no, I mean, but you were trying to oh, yeah. No. Well, because they want to do this, they do this, I mean, so give me a break. The people should just close down. There's so many. Oh, that's absolutely human nature. But, here we go. I don't know. I want nobody here. I don't want to see it. No, because they know nothing. So when somebody knows nothing, those are the people I like to talk to also. Somebody says to me one time, "Oh, just so right." And I stopped where I am. I go, "Okay." And then somebody said, "I think you're always so ugly. We never see you when you're really down." I said, "You don't think I can have a house like that today, do you? Why would I ever want to do that?" But I mean, really, wow. After the first time I walked in the synagogue with my girlfriends, and there was a service going on, so of course we're reading this way. The wonderful people go, "Excuse me, obviously you're not Jewish." He goes the other way. Not that we can read it anyway. No, but we I gotta get that book again, Conversations with Rabbi Daniel. It's been a long time. I think it was back in the 70s. It's been a long time. Yeah. Write it down. Conversations with Rabbi Daniel. Did you write it down? Was it in Manhattan? I don't know. I think New York State. Oh, New York City. It's a famous one, though. I can't go. I and I just so love it. Especially the picture. I don't know. Wow. It was neat to attend. I'm not a
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I have just a few quick things to tell you about. Idaho Abortion Rights has a lot of interesting material at a table right out there in the lobby. If you're parched, there are bottles of water. And the cards that you were given are for you to write questions on. At the very end of the evening, we'll have a question and answer. And so if anything occurs to you during the evening, go ahead and jot it down, and we will be collecting those. And now, Reverend Dr. Duane Anders, who is the senior pastor here at Cathedral of the Rockies, has a few words of welcome.
I heard that. Few words. Okay.
Oh.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Duane. I'm one of the pastors here. We're just glad to gather anyone that wanted to come and be part of the conversation. And we got great speakers tonight. I'm honored to sit at your feet tonight and listen and learn and to be part of the community. So we're glad you're here and look forward to the conversation. Is that few enough?
Yeah, that was very few. I am, by the way, Irene Laudeman, and I'm also one of the pastors here at Cathedral of the Rockies. And it's my honor to introduce somebody who I think is known to quite a few of you, Rabbi Daniel Fink. He has lived in the Valley for 28 years, been the rabbi at Congregation Ahavath Beth Israel. And he's a longtime friend at Cathedral of the Rockies. He's also a longtime activist here in the Valley, and has actually been active on a range of issues, including environmental justice, and he is an advocate for women's reproductive rights. He served for a time as the president of Idaho Planned Parenthood. And he has also testified quite a bit at the state legislature. So again, on a range of issues, but he's been able to go in there and talk with our legislators, and one can only hope perhaps influence their views a little bit. So he knows the inside of our Capitol building. He also knows the outside because he has certainly attended any number of protests over the years. So if you would please help me welcome Rabbi Dan Fink.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on maybe our first night of our first winter night, for braving the snow and the cold. It is always a pleasure and an honor for me to be here at the Cathedral, and it is a great honor for me to be here this evening with Rebecca Todd-Peters, who you will hear from shortly. I want to offer a short and concise, which is not very Jewish, but nonetheless a short and relatively concise statement about where Jewish tradition comes down on the question of reproductive choice. So before I do, I always like to start by saying, one, I speak for myself. I don't speak as the voice of the Jewish tradition. There is no such thing in the Jewish tradition. We have no hierarchy. There's no equivalent of bishops or cardinals or anything of the like. Essentially, every rabbi is their own authority, and the authority that they have is not theological, which is to say rabbis aren't considered closer to God. We don't have any more direct a line than anybody else does. The authority of the rabbi, you have to understand the meaning of the word. Rabbi means teacher. So any authority that a rabbi has is just by virtue of the knowledge that they share, and being a teacher means also being a learner. So ask 3 rabbis, you'll invariably get 3 different opinions on most things. In fact, there's an old Jewish saying that says, for every 2 Jews, there are at least 3 opinions. We are a people, like having said again that we don't have a hierarchy, people immediately, when I tell them that, they say, well, doesn't that make it kind of chaotic? And who knows what are the positions of congregation, what are the positions of the Jewish tradition? And I say, yes, it does make it chaotic. And we argue about it a lot, and we like it that way. We are a tradition. I mean, we go back to, in the Torah portion that we're reading this week as part of our liturgical cycle, we're introduced to Abraham arguing with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses argues with God. So we see ourselves as in a prophetic tradition that argues with God, and once you've been given permission to argue with God, then it's a slippery slope to arguing with one another, where you might more likely win, or not. Caveat 2, within the American Jewish community there are different, what we call movements. You might think of them as kind of like denominations. There are different movements within the Jewish community. And I also want to note that there is a difference in our Jewish community between Judaism and Jewishness. So you will meet Jews who will tell you right off, I don't practice Judaism, okay? So being a Jew, Judaism is the religious part of the Jewish spectrum. About half the Jews in the United States are associated with a movement, with synagogues and rabbis and traditional Jewish practice of one means or another. There are half the Jews in the United States will most often classify themselves as spiritual but not religious, which is to say they're not religiously Jewish, but they are ethnically, culturally, not racially, but ethnically and culturally Jewish. So within the approximately 1/2 of the Jews who live in America who are practicing Judaism as a religious tradition, there are 3 broad movements. And essentially they break down along the question of change. You have the Orthodox, who are the most traditional, who, when there is a challenge, a weighing of tradition versus change, they are most likely to fall on the side of tradition. And I want to, note before saying this, for everybody there's both tradition and change. Because if you don't the only things that don't change are things that are dead. And the only things that are all change are things that are utterly ephemeral. So every religious community, every practice, every tradition has to embrace both tradition and change, but not in the same ratio. So the Orthodox are going to fall on the side of tradition more often than not. The Reform movement that I was ordained in is on the other side of the spectrum. We are the most liberal, the most likely to embrace the change side of that equation, and where it gets conservative, where it gets confusing, is the conservative are not the conservative, right? The Orthodox are the conservative, as it were, but the middle movement is the conservative Jewish movement, and they are the moderates. They're more inclined toward change than the Orthodox. They're more inclined toward tradition than the Reform. So the conservative are not the conservative, and that's the way it is. So, that said, and having told you that Jews disagree on most things, within the non-Orthodox, which is to say the Reform, the conservative, other smaller movements, Reconstructionist, Jewish Renewal, within the non-Orthodox piece of the American Jewish community, which is about 80% of the American Jewish community that is synagogue affiliated, that community is overwhelmingly pro-choice and officially pro-choice. You will find some Jews in Reform and conservative and Reconstructionist synagogues that are not pro-choice, usually a very small number, but they will, in any progressive Jewish community, They will be a minority. The overwhelming majority, you will find, will be pro-choice, and the movements themselves are officially, ardently, passionately pro-choice. The Orthodox world is more subtle. There are people in the Orthodox world who probably would define themselves as not pro-choice, as anti-abortion. There are people in the Orthodox world who are strongly pro-choice. But the one thing that everybody agrees on, and there is almost nothing that all Jews agree on. So this is an unusual thing, and I offer this because I can very rarely say unequivocally there's something all Jews agree upon. But Jewish law and tradition is very firm and clear and black and white the way it is on almost nothing, insofar as nobody in the Jewish world believes that abortion is murder. Okay? That doesn't mean everybody thinks it's okay. In the Orthodox world, there are, again, people who are pretty strongly anti-abortion, but they do not believe, as the Catholic Church believes and as many in the evangelical world believe, that human life begins at conception and therefore abortion is murder. There is a biblical basis for that unusual consensus in the Jewish community, and it comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 21. The discussion, which doesn't seem to be about abortion, and it really isn't first and foremost, but the scene is two men are arguing over something. And one of them pushes, as kind of collateral damage to their argument, pushes a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry. The question is, what is the punishment for the one who causes the miscarriage? Torah says this: when this happens and no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as it is exacted, the payment to be based on the reckoning. But if other damage ensues, which is to say, if the woman, as we understand it, is hurt or killed by the same action, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, life for life. Which is to say that in the Torah, again, this is not true in contemporary Jewish life. Judaism is overwhelmingly anti-capital punishment. But in Torah, there's capital punishment for a lot of things. And one of those things is murder. So if a fetus was considered a human life, then the punishment for causing a miscarriage would be capital punishment, because you have essentially murdered a human being. But Torah is very explicit. To cause a woman to miscarry is not to murder a human being. It's not okay, there's a punishment for it, but one is not executed in the same way as if in that same fight the woman's life is taken, in which case the one who takes the life would be executed. Okay, fair? So far, so good? Okay. On the basis of that biblical passage, the Mishnah, which is a book of Jewish law from around the year 200 or so, that becomes in many ways the standard for Jewish practice, goes on to say this: if a woman is having trouble giving birth, we cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because the life of the woman comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part of the child, which is usually taken to say the head, which is crowning, if crowning has occurred, one may not touch the child, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. Okay? So the basic premise is until birth, until crowning, the life of the woman always takes priority over the life of the fetus that she is carrying. The woman's life is a human life. The fetus's life is a potential life. And human life always takes priority over potential life. On that, Jews are across the board, from the most reform of reform to the most orthodox of orthodox. On that, there is agreement. Now, to what extent are we permitted to take the potential life for the sake of the woman who is a full human life? On that's where within the Orthodox community there's disagreement. Okay? In the Jewish world generally, there's agreement that life extends to not just life but also health. In the Orthodox world, most people will say these are the only reasons to permit an abortion, which is to say the life or the health of the woman is endangered. And this is where the liberal side of the Orthodox world define health liberally. Health includes mental health, it includes the woman's well-being, whereas in the more right-leaning parts of the Jewish world, life or health means life or potentially life-threatening circumstances. Those are the only ones in which one is permitted to abort the fetus. That's essentially where the Jewish world lies on the question. So again, the liberal Jewish world, which is the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish world, based on the notion that the life of the one carrying the child, the potential child, always takes precedence over that of the fetus. We believe that it is the woman's choice, and we respect, and we, to choose the title of the book, we trust women. We trust women to know what is best for them. We trust them to know their bodies. We trust them to know what they need for their health, for their families. We trust them. And finally, because of what I have told you is the Jewish view, abortion bans, like the one we have in this state, are, from the perspective of the Jewish community, a gross violation of religious freedom. Okay? Abortion bans are based on an understanding that human life begins at conception. That is the understanding of some, again, of the Catholics, of many of the evangelicals. That is their right to hold that perspective, but it is a subjective perspective, and there are many of us, including, again, the entirety of the Jewish tradition, who do not see it that way. And therefore, to deny a Jewish woman the right to make a choice is to deny her the ability to act in accordance with her faith tradition. And I will go so far as to say that not only does Jewish tradition allow for a woman to choose, but when the life or the significant health of the woman is endangered by a pregnancy, Jewish law actually requires an abortion. Okay? Because Jewish law is very clear, the life of the mother takes priority over the potential life of the fetus. A Jewish woman living in Idaho today doesn't have that freedom to practice her tradition, as we are called to practice our tradition. So the law, as it currently stands in this state and too many others, is a violation ethically, morally, of women's fundamental human rights, and it is also a violation of the religious freedom of my community and many, many other communities that don't see conception as the beginning of human life. Questions afterwards? Is that the... Okay, so I will step down and thank you.
Thanks, Dan. We appreciate your words and beginning of the conversation. Rebecca Todd is going to come and share with us. Her book, for me, was very helpful when the United Methodist Church said, hey, we need a single white guy to write a conversation on this. I was like, why are you asking me to write something about this? Why not? So I leaned into your book heavily, and you helped me expand my perspective and maybe bring some folks into the conversation. So come and share with us, Rebecca.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you to Irene and Duane for the invitation to be with you, and it's such a pleasure to be able to follow Rabbi Fink and to be able to not have to go over a whole lot of stuff that he already covered. So that's fabulous because there's so much to say. So I will move us through this. So, you know, election day was yesterday. There have been a lot of people who have been thinking about what's been going on across the country. I imagine many of you were watching election returns and looking today at what's been happening across the country. Many people have been asking the question, is abortion on the ballot? Is abortion going to bring people to the polls? What do we know since yesterday? So there were 3 ballot initiatives that were trying to increase access and to put into state constitutions access. All 3 of those passed. There were 2 that were rejecting increased bans and limitations on women's access, and both of those were rejected. So we have had, in all 5 states that it was on the ballot, we have had success, and that followed Kansas back in August, I think. So there's some good news on that front in terms of what has happened in the elections. And so that's just sort of the frame for how we're thinking about this post-Roe, post-Dobbs world, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you want to. So what I'm really here to talk with you about is Christianity and abortion, right? So most people in the country think Christianity is against abortion. That's really the dominant perceived understanding of how Christianity relates to and thinks about abortion. And it's not surprising, right? Because all across the country, billboards and bumper stickers and license plates, it's all car related, but it's people also, you know, marching and protesting at clinics with let's get that slide off just because it's so horrible. This one's not much better. But the imagery is offensive, and it is taking out of context the reality of what's happening biologically when 90% of abortions are happening in the first 12 weeks. Doesn't look anything like that. The picture there is a prenate very close to birth. And that is not what's happening in abortion in the country. But what is happening with Christianity and abortion in the country is that evangelical Christians and Catholics are very loud and very vocal and very visible in saying that Christianity is against abortion. And mainline Protestants, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister. This is a wonderful United Methodist Church congregation. We are not talking publicly about abortion and Christianity, and we are not saying what we ought to be saying. And this is part of, I think, what the problem is in the country. We've ceded the theological ground, the moral ground, to the evangelicals and to the Catholics through our silence. And so we have to speak out. We have to speak out as religious people. If you are someone who supports abortion access and you do that publicly, and you go to marches or you speak out or you lobby your legislators, don't do it as a secular person. Don't just do it as a secular person. Do it as a religious person. Talk about your faith. Talk about why your commitment to abortion access is part of your faith. The very broad and deep discussion around the history of Judaism in relation to this topic is well known among my Jewish friends and colleagues, but that is not the same for Christianity. And we have not been teaching this from the pulpit. We have not been teaching this in our churches and talking about this in our communities in the ways that we should be. So, so that really leads us to the question, is Christianity against abortion? There are lots of people out there saying that it is. But there is a long history of Christian support for abortion access in this country. In 1967, a group of rabbis and Christian clergy formed the Clergy Consultation Service that developed a network across the country of hundreds of clergy who helped women get access to safe and legal abortion services at a time when it was criminalized and very dangerous. And these folks were part of also helping change the culture across the country as they spoke out in their communities and as they helped publicize the fact that that clergy, both Jewish and Christian, were supportive of women's ability to have safe access to abortion care. I don't know if you can see this. It shows polling data. The one on the left is all Americans. The next one is white evangelicals. So if you can see the green line at least, you can see that's the only majority anti-choice group in the country is evangelical Christians. Every other group of Christians, and we have, if you can't see, you see white mainline Protestants, you see black Protestants, Catholics. Each of those groups, majority support for legal access to abortion in the country. Here you can see 70% of Jews are supportive of legal access, 51% of Muslims, almost 70% of Buddhists, 62% Hindu, 83% of Unitarians. So again, across the board, religious people support legal access to abortion. All of the religious groups, except for evangelical Christians, right? Even the Catholics. If you disaggregate the Catholics, you will find Hispanic Catholics are against abortion, a majority, but the whole group of Catholics is supportive of legal access. So you have evangelical Christians and Catholic clergy who are very vocal and very outspoken in their perspectives around abortion. And this is another slide from that same poll, which I think is really helpful because this shows support for abortion bans. These are the people who think that abortion should be completely banned in our country. And even the white evangelical Protestants, I think it's only, 28%, right? So even within white evangelical Protestants, they don't think it should be banned. So what is happening in the country doesn't reflect anybody's perspective other than the Supreme Court justices and then some of the legislators in state legislatures that are passing. But they're certainly not representing the people in their states. When they're doing this. So let's talk about abortion in Christian history, right? So we've already gotten some information and context on Exodus. Abortion isn't mentioned in the Bible at all. It is not referred to. Abortion was available in the ancient Near East. We have medical texts and recipes for abortifacients, and we know that people were having abortions. And there's a lot of things that the Bible prohibits or says you shouldn't do. It never says a word about abortion. And so this is a really important recognition of the reality in terms of the life in the ancient Near East, that this was not part of the predominant culture at the time. Now, when we do think about when abortion comes up in Christian history through the writings of theologians or church fathers, one of the places we see that coming up is in the idea of ensoulment. So there's a lot of interest in when does the soul enter into the prenate. And at that point, there is concern for abortion or ending a pregnancy. So through most of Christian history, really up until about 150 years ago, pregnancy was confirmed when a woman felt movement. It's called quickening, right? You first feel the first movements inside the womb, and that's when a pregnancy was confirmed. Prior to that, the church didn't consider abortion homicide. It was only after quickening that it was considered homicide. This was the point at which there was a theological interest or concern in ending a pregnancy, but quickening happens somewhere between 16 and 20 weeks. Again, when 90% of the abortions in this country, actually, if you're talking about 16 to 20 weeks, it's more like 96% of the abortions in this country have already happened by that point. So when you hear people talking about, oh, we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that, most of the things they're saying we shouldn't do, no one is doing. And it's a way to really upset people and to get them emotionally invested in supporting abortion bans or limiting access or stereotyping women who have abortions. And so it's really important. We're going to talk about some of the facts in a minute. It's really important to know the facts. Third point I want to make here is that abortion in church history, in sort of theological writings, is often mentioned in passing. It's not a major point of concern for any theologian, and it doesn't become a real topic within debates in the church until the modern era, until our own era. And it's often part of a general denouncement of sexual immorality. So if a theologian is talking about, you shouldn't fornicate and you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, you shouldn't have sex while you're menstruating, you shouldn't masturbate, right? There's a list of things you shouldn't do, and abortion is included sort of alongside a whole bunch of lists of things. So sort of general denouncement of sexual immorality. And then again, the primary concern or interest in abortion through the mid-1800s is really in abortion as sexual sin, and what theologians meant by this is the purpose of sex was considered to be procreation. And if you were engaged in any action that was preventing procreation, that was the sin. The sin didn't have anything to do with the personhood of the prenate or the moral status of the prenate. It was the idea that you were not allowing sex to be fulfilling its purpose. And so, ideas in Christian history have changed around how we think about the purpose of sex and what sex is for in our lives and in our relationships. And we haven't, in mainline Protestantism, understood the purpose of sex to be procreation for over a century. And so these are legacies of old theological teachings that, because we don't like to talk about sex in church, we haven't really revised or brought up to date with, or in the same ways that we have with many other aspects of our theological thinking. So why has the Christian right been able to define the debate for us? One of the things that I like to talk about, we could talk about a lot of reasons, but fundamentally one of the biggest cultural, social reasons goes back to interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in this story, there's two creation stories, right? In the first creation story, male and female are created together. In the second creation story, there's this idea that Eve comes out of Adam. Eve is created to be a helpmate for Adam. And then after this creation story, when they are in the garden and Eve chooses to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she is our foremother in moral discernment, and yet that's not how the story's interpreted. The story is interpreted that Eve was tempted, that she ate of the apple that she was forbidden to eat, that she then enticed and seduced her husband into eating the apple, and that she was then cursed by God, right? So the notion of menstruation as the curse comes from interpretations of this story. And they are cast out of the garden, and the text never curses Eve or Adam. To the woman, God said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. So these stories, these mythological beginnings that are part of all religious traditions, but we find them in Genesis in particular, scholars refer to them as etiologies. An etiology is a story that a community has to help them understand something about their current situation, about their lives, about why the world is the way it is. And so in the ancient world, childbearing was difficult. Women died. It was painful. And this story is one of those etiologies that helped the community understand and explain, why is it that childbearing is so difficult? So this has led to what I call a justification framework for Christianity, and I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit. And what I mean by that is, in the context, in the cultural, social context of Western civilization, women are required to justify their abortions, to justify their desire to end a pregnancy. And within this Christian justification framework, all pregnancies are understood to be gifts from God. Prenates, that's a term that I use for the entity as long as it's inside a woman's body. Prenates are full human beings from the moment of conception, and women are morally obligated to gestate when they're pregnant, right? This is part of that notion of what does it mean to be a woman? It means that you give birth. That's what your purpose in life is. And just to highlight some of how these ideas have been passed down through Christian history, I have some quotes from some Christian church fathers. Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century said, every woman should be filled with shame by the thought that she is a woman. The consciousness of their own nature must evoke feelings of shame. Augustine in the 4th and 5th century, I don't see what sort of help woman was created to provide man with if one excludes procreation. If woman is not given to man for help in bearing children, what help could she be? Martin Luther in the 16th century said, the word and works of God is quite clear that women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. And John Wesley, wife, be content to be insignificant. What loss would it be to God or man had you never been born? Unless you think that these ideas ended in the Middle Ages, Russell Moore, who's a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention not so long ago, said, patriarchy is good for women, it's good for children, and it's good for families. The question for us is not whether we will have patriarchy, but what kind. And he made these remarks in response to a group of feminists in the Southern Baptist Convention who were arguing for a version of feminism known as complementarianism. If you don't know what that is, what that means is that women were created to do one thing and men were created to do another thing, but they're equal in the eyes of God. And even though we have these gendered roles that are our lot in life, we should regard them as equal. And he said, no, they're not equal. You have your role, and it needs to be within the hierarchy of a very well-established patriarchy where men are in charge. So there you go. So it has left us in Western civilization like Luther said with this division for women to be either prostitutes, whores, and temptresses, or virgins and mothers. And there's very little path within that cultural tradition for flexibility and recognition of the complexity of gender and of gender roles and of what it means to be a woman. So this has led to very misogynistic ideas that come out of Christianity. Women were created to attend to men's needs. God ordained that men should rule over women. Women are deceptive, seductive, and sexual creatures. And childbearing is women's punishment for disobeying God, right? So I'm a feminist theologian. I reinterpret all of these stories in much different ways. But what I'm trying to communicate with you is this is the way that Christianity has been traditioned to many people, particularly within evangelical culture. And when we think and talk about what does the family look like in that evangelical worldview, it's a deep part of what's happening across the country right now. So I want to talk a little bit more about this justification framework that I mentioned, and I want to start with some of this polling data. So in these polls, the question that is usually asked is, do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances? Do you think it should be legal under certain circumstances? Or do you think it should be completely illegal? Right? And you can see the bottom line, that dotted line, the smallest number of people think it should be completely illegal, right? So that's the good news. That's always been a minority position. If you see the very end, I know these are very small, can you at least see that dip? The very last dip and then the uptick on the completely legal all the time. That's after Dobbs. So we did see some shift in the country after the Dobbs decision as people began to see and realize sort of the implications of some of these legal decisions or laws. But the top line is the one I want to focus on. It's the most steady. It's been the majority of the country for the longest period of time. It hovers, it's almost always just above 50%, but it'll go up and down a little bit. And that's the group who thinks that abortion should be legal under certain circumstances. And so that's what I want us to think about. What are these certain circumstances? Under what conditions are people thinking that abortion is okay? This is why I talk about abortion as being justified. In this justification framework, the focus is really on when does life begin. It's on that idea that conception, at that moment of fertilization, you have a life that is equivalent to a baby that has been born. And that is a theological belief. It's a fine theological belief if you want to have it. I would respect it if you have it. But you shouldn't impose your theological belief on me or on our Jewish brothers and sisters when it is a clear violation of religious freedom. But those certain circumstances are what I've labeled the prim reasons. They're prenatal health, rape, incest, and mother's life. These are the 4 certain circumstances that people are allowing as quote-unquote justifiable reasons. It's okay for you if you have to have abortion under those circumstances. And we know that, this slide, majority, long-term, longitudinal data over decades, there's been majority support for all 4 of these prim reasons. But what these prim reasons have done is drive a moral sword between 2 groups of women in this country to say, these women are okay. In fact, we should have empathy and compassion for them because they're in tragic circumstances where they had to make this unfortunate decision. We know they wouldn't have if it had been under other circumstances because they're good mothers and good women, and that's what good women do. But these women are sinful and sort of everyone, a stereotype you want to put over there, right? Irresponsible and licentious and, just out for a good time, like all the sorts of things people say. But the reality is, and certainly prim reasons are tragic, right? So prenatal health, rape, incest, mother's life, those are tragic reasons that people choose to end a pregnancy. I've had 2 abortions. One of mine was tragic, one of them was not. And in those circumstances, there's a whole lot of empathy that is generated. But the problem, well, there are a lot of problems. One of the problems with the way that's framed is that's just over a quarter of abortions in the country. So what we're saying is 75% of people in the country are irresponsible, are sluts, are, out there having a good time and not thinking about anything related to responsibility for their actions. And those are the damned, right? I don't want to have a baby abortions, what Katie Watson, the legal scholar, just calls ordinary abortions. And this is the root of the justification paradigm, that some abortions are okay and justifiable, and some abortions not just are not okay, they're to be condemned, and the people who have them are to be condemned. And that's what has created the enormous stigma in our country that prevents women from feeling like they can talk about their abortion experiences. When they're going through them, certainly when they might actually need support and help from people in their life, but also afterwards. The fear of people's reactions and responses to their abortions mean that the majority of people in the country they don't tell anyone about their experiences, which is, again, part of why that vacuum has been filled by the religious right, because you have all kinds of people who, again, I should say, about 5% of people regret their abortions, but they're the only ones we hear from, because they're the ones who are being propped up in front of people to say, I regretted my abortion. Now, I will also go on record, I don't want anyone to regret an abortion. I don't want anyone to have an abortion that doesn't want to have an abortion. Neither does anyone I know in the pro-choice movement. People want people to be able to make the life decisions, the healthcare decisions, the decisions about parenting and family that are right for them. And we need to have the public policies in place to support that on every side. So the justification framework is fundamentally flawed. It distorts our conversation and impedes dialogue. It harms women and pregnant people. We talked about stigma. It's also focused on the wrong moral question. I have a whole chapter where I go through, if you're interested, and deconstruct the justification framework. So I won't do a lot of that right now. But I will just highlight this moral question, because the justification framework is really focused on this abstract philosophical question: is abortion right or wrong? And that's not the question that women ask. The moral question that women ask when faced with a problem pregnancy or an unplanned pregnancy is, what should I do? That is a very real moral question that has a timeline on it. And they have to figure that out. And as people of faith, we're not helping them. We don't have resources for them. We don't have support systems for them. And it's true beyond just the religious community, but I would say as a Presbyterian minister, because they need help making difficult decisions, and many people don't feel like they can go to their pastors. And so people are out there making decisions on their own. And so the very real moral question of what should I do when faced with this unplanned or problem pregnancy, that's the question that should be shaping our public policy. Because if we ask that question, we might actually be creating public policies that help people answer that in ways that were affirming for them, life-affirming for them, and potentially enable them to make, be more equipped to make that decision effectively. So again, to go back to the question that I asked, why has the religious right been so successful in shaping this debate? Some of it is that legacy of Christian tradition and history, even though the tradition hasn't been anti-abortion, abortion has been weaponized by evangelicals and Catholics, and they have convinced people that Christianity has always been against abortion. And while there are some theologians, some documents that have, in Christian history, that have said things about abortion, one, we already established that it wasn't until after 16 to 20 weeks that they were even talking about. Like when they say abortion, we're against abortion or abortion is murder. It wasn't what we talk about abortion happening in the first 16 weeks, right? So it was something totally different. Nevertheless, abortion has been weaponized as a political issue. And you probably can't see these at all, but if you can at least see the trend lines, this shows the way abortion has also been politicized. On the left of each of those three columns, you'll see the data from the 1970s, and then it goes over to 2018. And what you'll see in each of those categories is that in the 70s, there wasn't a partisan difference between where people came out on any of these questions. And because it was politicized and then written into party platforms, it became a political issue. It was made into a political issue in order to get people to the polls, in order to have success on other issues. Randall Balmer wrote a really good book called, it's very short, it's called Bad Faith. And he demonstrates the way in which, he's a scholar of evangelicalism, he demonstrates the way in which it's a myth that abortion was the issue that galvanized the evangelicals in the 1970s. It was actually a different Supreme Court case that was going to take funding away from parochial schools. And there were all of these evangelical schools that were going to lose access to funding. And so they were looking for an issue and they didn't think that was sexy enough to get evangelicals to care about what was happening. And so they really picked up the issue of abortion and made that into an issue. And so if you're interested in that history, it's a fascinating, it's a fascinating analysis of that history. So in 2010, the first midterm election after Obama, we saw the sweep of Republican state houses across the country, which is important because of the second slide. If you see that spike in these are statewide laws that were passed related to abortion. The first spike on the right-hand side, and then all of those laws that were passed, that's all after those state legislatures flipped. And after it was made into a partisan issue, and it became this Republican rallying cry. And that is the context that then led us to the Dobbs decision, right? So this has been a long time in the making. It's been decades in the making. And what one of my deep interests is in talking with people is recognizing that it has taken decades for the evangelicals and the Catholics to change people's minds in this country about how they think and feel about this topic. And it is a long road for us to be part of shifting that cultural conversation to a different place. So even if the laws were to be overturned tomorrow, I hope you will not walk away from this issue, because that's not going to change the cultural attitude in the country. It won't do a thing to touch stigma for the people and the women who have abortions in this country, and for their ability to be supported by their families and their friends and their communities and their pastors in this country. So here you can see Idaho. I'm sure you all already know this if you're here at this lecture. One of the most restrictive states. I've been distressed to hear what I've been reading about the universities, and even to the point, I think it's what University of Iowa and Boise State are both, and whether they're even going to provide contraception to college women. Right. I read that you can have condoms for STDs, right? You know, who cares if you get pregnant? That's your problem, lady, right? I mean, this is oh, God. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so there you go. So I think one of the things I really hope you'll take away from our conversation tonight is that abortion is not a political issue. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's a justice issue. And it's an issue that I, as a Christian, if you are a Christian or a person of faith, I hope you will talk about from that faith perspective. And part of what you need to do, part of what we all need to do is know the facts. When I first started doing this research and learning about what is going on in the country, I was stunned when I found out that 45% of pregnancies in the country are unplanned. That's just a stunning number of unplanned pregnancies. Now, many of those become wanted pregnancies. 60% of those become wanted pregnancies. What scholars know is if an unplanned pregnancy happens within about 1 to 2 years on either side of thinking you might want to have another child or a child, it's more likely to become a wanted pregnancy. But that's just a lot of unplanned pregnancies. And when you may also have seen that the abortion rate is the lowest it's been since Roe v. Wade. That's not because abortions have decreased, but it's because unplanned pregnancies have decreased. Consistently, about 40% of unplanned pregnancies are terminated. And so if you reduce the unplanned pregnancy rate, you reduce the abortion rate. And we have data around that. We know this to be true. So anyway, 45% or 45% of pregnancies in the U.S. are unplanned. About 42% of all unplanned pregnancies are terminated consistently. That means about 20% of all pregnancies end in abortion. And that also means that a quarter of women in the country will have an abortion by the age of 45. Another thing that we know is that fertility lasts a really long time. Women spend about 2.7 years pregnant, trying to get pregnant, postpartum, and over 30 years trying not to get pregnant. That is a long time. And contraceptive failure, I have a chart in my book, I should put it on one of these slides. Contraceptive failure rates, when you hear them at your doctor's office, are for 1 year. If you look at them over 10 years, they are significant. The failure rates are significantly higher. And so, yeah. Long-acting reversible contraceptives, so basically IUDs, are that and vasectomies, right, are the highest level of success or the lowest level of failure. So who has abortions in the country? Well, religious women and people have abortions. You probably can't see this either, but 62% of people, you can see sort of Protestants over there, and then Roman Catholics, and then other is 7%. But 62% of people having abortions claim some sort of religious affiliation. And that's the same representation as we are all represented in the general public. There's a very slight decrease for evangelical women, but given the rhetoric in the evangelical community, it's not nearly as few as you would imagine. Mothers have abortions. 60% of the people ending a pregnancy already have at least one child. And poor women have abortions. And so this is a statistic that I think is really important for us to all recognize. If you can see over on the left, you can at least see sort of the way the lines are going. That's the mid-'80s. And in the mid-'80s, about half of the women having abortions were poor or twice the poverty rate. So two things about that. One is twice the poverty rate now is what the poverty rate measured in 1963, when it was created by Molly Orshansky, who worked at the Social Security Administration. She was a mathematician. They came to her and said, we need to be able to measure poverty in the country. She said, oh, well, people spend about a third of their income on food. I'll take the USDA food basket, multiply it by 3, that'll be our poverty line. Now, food is about a sixth of people's spending. So functionally, what the poverty line measured in 1963, you need to double it to get what poverty measured, what poverty now was measuring then. So when we look at that number and we see 50% are within, twice the poverty line, we're really talking about people in poverty. We just can't change the poverty line because no one could survive that politically. You would double our poverty numbers overnight. But that's the first point. Second point that's disturbing about this trend is by the, what is that, 2014? Yeah, 2014, we're up to 75% of poor women having abortions. That is largely due to women with access to health care, to insurance, being able to use long-acting reversible contraceptives. Remember what I just told you about LARCs? LARCs are helping reduce unplanned pregnancy rates. So we have unplanned pregnancy rates going down, we have abortion rates going down, but we have poor women going up because we're not helping all people access the health care that they need. We also know that the majority of people having abortion, or the largest group of people having abortions, are white. Here you can see we have about 34%, 36%. But Black and Latina women are overrepresented among abortion patients because they're overrepresented among the poor. And we just saw that 75% of the people having abortions are poor, right? So again, it's not about the morality of any of these people, and yet that's what is portrayed in those stereotypes about who is having abortions, given the demographics. So this is something I alluded to earlier. The current political landscape, right? The pro-choice movement is secular, the anti-choice movement is Christian, and it has completely erased the Christian group that supports access to abortion. And that is what I hope people like you will be part of, speaking out and reviving and having more of a voice. So I hope you have a sense of what the justification framework is, about why and how it's harmful and damaging. When I wrote this book, I didn't want to just leave people and say, okay, go figure it out. Don't use that justification stuff anymore. If we're going to change the framework, we need a new framework. And what I learned in the work that I did is the framework of reproductive justice that was created by 12 Black women in 1994 who attended a Clinton healthcare, in the midst of the Clinton healthcare reform, they attended a conference on choice, and there were 12 of them, and they found each other, and they said, all of this conversation doesn't reflect our community. It's not about choice. Choice implies that you could choose something else, right? There's a certain amount of lack of choice in the communities that we live and work in. But it's not only that, it's also the fact that children in these communities are dying. They're dying from preventable things, bad health care, but they're also dying because of violence in their communities, environmental toxins, and we need to reframe the conversation in our country so we aren't so focused in on abortion. Abortion is this one thing that happens in this whole long life. And how do we think about that long 30 to 40 years of reproductive experience and have a conversation that's talking about all of that, right? Women in our communities, again, Black women saying this, don't have access to infertility treatment. Many of them are still victims of being sterilized against their will. So there's this long legacy and history and tradition of both forced pregnancy in Black communities and, the inability to have children when you have forced sterilization. So there's this long history and legacy. As they came together, they created these 4 principles: the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, the right to parent in safe and healthy communities, and the right to bodily autonomy. And I have learned an enormous amount from the reproductive justice movement about how we can and should be expanding our conversation in the country around a larger range of issues related to women's reproductive health, women's reproductive lives and bodies and choices, and making sure that all women in the country have the access to gynecological cancer treatment, right? I mean, there's just so many pieces of this that people don't have access to. And so much of our attention and our time and our money is focused on this abortion debate, and it's distracting us from the healthy lived reality of people's lives. And we need to go back toward thinking about the fullness and the richness of our reproductive lives. So in this, all religious voices matter. As a Christian minister, I am encouraging Christians to speak up on this topic, precisely because Christian voices are the linchpin of this debate. And Christian voices need to challenge those conservative voices. Also because the stigma that's coming from Christian theology is damaging women and families. And we need new ways to think and talk about pregnancy and abortion and mothering and parenting. So I encourage you all to be part of changing the conversation. Refuse to be in dialogue with anyone around those justification terms, the prim reasons. Don't let your legislature use those to carve out exceptions or bans or to frame who should or shouldn't have access. As you work on the work you need to do here in the country. Educate, you're already doing that, which is great. I have a book that I'm co-editing with a colleague coming out in January that's Abortion and Religion in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's a collected volume, so it's got primary text from each of those traditions, it's got social scientific studies, it's got theology, and just a lot of stuff. So if you're interested in the topic, that is something that you might be interested in. Fight abortion stigma. This is one of a pair of yard signs that I'll tell you about the Sacred Congregation Network in a minute. This is one of 2 yard signs that we created. Get a whole bunch printed and plaster them all over Idaho. I'm currently working on a new research project, the Abortion and Religion Project. If you're interested, you can find it at abortionandreligion.com. So I'm white Protestant. I have a Black Protestant colleague, a Jewish colleague, a Muslim colleague, a Catholic colleague. 5 of us. And we're interviewing women from our traditions having abortions across the country right now. Because we want to document their stories, we want to share their stories, we want to challenge those stereotypes. So I encourage you, get on our mailing list, learn more about those stories, help dispel those stereotypes about who's having abortions and why. And then become a sacred community. So sacred congregations, sacred stands for Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. It's a congregational designation. We're encouraging congregations to go through a study process to talk together from this reproductive justice base, which is very much a sort of anti-white supremacy base, to think and talk about a lot of the things that I've raised in our conversation tonight. I can tell you more about that if you're interested. But it started in Texas, and those congregations proclaimed, in our sacred space, we respect and trust women. We promise that women who attend our congregation will be free from stigma, shame, or judgment for their reproductive decisions, including abortion. And we believe access to comprehensive and affordable reproductive health service is a moral and social good. So I encourage you to become part of the Sacred Congregation movement. And thank you for having me here this evening.
So this is the question and answer portion of our evening. I think Donna is going to be coming around, as is Carla, I think, on this side, to collect up any questions that you have, and then we'll have a conversation with both Rabbi Fink and Reverend Dr. Todd-Peters.
Should I start? Sure. How can we as Christians open... Do you want to look through them and choose? Because I'm not sure we can answer them all. How can we as Christians open the door to these conversations with our family members and friends that come out as one-issue voters against abortion and may not be willing to be open? So this is a common question, not surprisingly, and I think that one of the most important things that we need to be doing in the country around this issue and around a lot of issues is talking to each other. We're not talking to each other. I actually did an interview with a reporter from the Idaho something. And she was saying, we were talking a little bit about this, and she said, so yeah, we need to get, maybe it's just we agree to disagree. And I said, no, we can't agree to disagree. We have to talk to each other. When we say, let's agree to disagree, it means we're not going to talk about this anymore. We're going to walk away, we're going to leave it over there, and we're not going to touch it. And that's happening on so many issues in our country. And we have to talk about these issues. And we have to listen to each other. I have to listen to people who may say things that I don't agree with and may even offend me. So part of what you have to do is to say, I'm assuming this is, you said a family member, I assume they care about you, is to say, hey, let's talk to each other about this, but let's remember not to hurt each other. How can we say what we need to say to each other in ways that recognize the humanity of the other person? And that you're actually somebody I care about, and I want to know more about who you are and why you think this, what you think and why you think this. Because maybe in each of you telling those stories, you're both transformed as part of that process. If we don't start these conversations with our family, there's no way we're having them with people we don't know. And so I encourage you to try to figure out, how can I invite someone to be in conversation? And so you said, how can we do this? One thing I would say is to try to talk with them about caring for each other and thinking about, what do you want out of this conversation? I don't want to convince you what I believe. I don't want you to convince me what you believe. I just want us to hear each other. And I want us to listen to each other. And maybe what you need to, because I know I do this all the time. When somebody's talking, I'm trying to think about what I'm going to say. So then you're not listening. So maybe you have a piece of paper and you say, okay, why don't you write down 4 things you want to make sure that you say to me? That way you're not worried about what you're going to say to me. And then you'll listen. Because we absolutely have to listen to each other. Do you want to say anything?
So, first I want to say thank you.
I learned so much listening to you, and thank you. Just a couple questions that I got pointed my way. How do you answer people who believe that abortion is directly going against God's will by way of Psalm 139? So I have to say, in Jewish tradition and different Christian traditions, we don't number the Psalms exactly the same way. So I'm not, I maybe need some clarification from whoever asked as what is the line that you're referring to?
Is this, I knit you together in your mother's womb?
Yeah, okay. It's a metaphor. I mean, God didn't literally knit us in the first place. You know, we're not wool. So the Psalms are poetry, and poetry speaks in metaphor. And I think the message of that psalm is God says, I care about you. I care about you. This is not a directive on when life begins. It's God saying, I care about you. That's my text, my sense on that one. This one, what are the Jewish faith's opinions on emergency procedures to aid in childbirth, such as C-sections? The answer is we're all for them. I mean, whatever keeps women and babies healthy is all a good thing. The last one, I'm going to throw this directed to me, but I'm going to throw back to you because it says Rabbi Fink mentioned that the Jewish culture emphasizes arguments with God and one another. Why is this culture so absent in many Christian circles regarding topics of politics, especially with abortion? So I'll leave it to Christians to answer why. I can tell you a little. I'll say one thing on it within Jewish tradition, and then allow those who know way more than me to speak about Christian tradition. It's a very old tradition in the Jewish community. Again, we draw on biblical examples. There's a very important, but having said that argument is an important and venerable part of our tradition, you need to take the second step and say, what kind of argument is productive and what kind of argument isn't, okay? So there's a statement in the Talmud that says, every argument that is conducted for the sake of heaven will endure. Not that the argument will last forever, but that it's a healthy thing. Arguments not conducted for the sake of heaven will not endure. So, screaming at somebody who's on a different side of an issue, you're a moron, that is not a helpful argument. I don't even really want to use the term argument. Conversation on a difficult item. So what makes a conversation for the sake of heaven is you're there to learn, you're there to listen, you're not listening to immediately respond, you're listening to be there with another human being created in the image of God like you. Not every Jewish argument in every Jewish community follows those guidelines. But that's what we aspire to, and that is part of our tradition. So I'll leave it to those who know more than me to talk about the culture within Christianity.
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of issues related to this question. I think one is that Christianity has historically been more of a doctrinal religion. So there have been sort of set beliefs that are put out as the belief, but that's really not true either, right? So, I mean, even if you want to say, up until the Reformation it was true, it's not, because there's the whole Orthodox Christian. And there are lots of branches of Orthodoxy, right? There's Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy, right? So there is no monolithic Christianity that has a single doctrine. And yet that idea of doctrinal purity is part of the mythology of Christianity. And so, I guess that's one way I would answer that. And the other way, I think, goes back to part of what you were alluding to in your remarks at the beginning. You didn't use the language of lived religion, but you were talking about the only religion that doesn't change is dead. And we are all part of lived religious communities, and lived religious communities change and grow, and the ideas and the teachings, it's not simply that they respond to the times, they're part of the times. And so that is just part of what it means to live and to grow, is to change. And so that's something that when you think about the reality of lived religion bumping up against this idea of doctrinal religion, what you often, or what we can find is, I'll use Orthodoxy as an example because it's an easy one. Within the Greek Orthodox tradition, there are very strong doctrinal opposition to abortion and homosexuality. Yet on a pastoral level, no one cares. No one doesn't care, but they don't talk about it. They're not trying to enforce these doctrinal prescriptions on people, and there is recognition of what it means to be human. And so there's this difference. Another sort of set of terms to think about is orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthodoxy is sameness or right belief, and orthopraxy is right action. And so those people who are so focused on right belief often don't really have deep consideration for the complexity of lived reality. And those who focus on right action are often less concerned about orthodoxy or right belief, and sort of that general sense of doctrinal purity. So that's some answers to that question. All right, well-meaning progressives trying to find middle ground will say, quote, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? That's the classic Bill Clinton quote. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Then the question is, how do we respond to help with these well-meaning conversations? So, yes, I think many times those folks are well-meaning. I think because they're well-meaning, they don't realize what they're saying, and they don't realize that what they're saying, that statement in and of itself is stigmatizing. There's an implication that they should be rare because there's something wrong with them. Sort of the classic response to that is abortion should be safe, legal, and where I live, right? So, but I don't want to diminish it, because you also don't want to put allies on the defensive either. But I think there's that one, safe, legal, and rare, that I think is really problematic, and that if you just invite people to think about it a little bit more and the ways that it might be stigmatizing, I think that can be helpful. And the other thing that I think is really stigmatizing, that I used to say this, people just don't recognize it's stigmatizing, is, well, I'm pro-choice, but I would never have one. Who the hell grows up and says, I want to grow up and have an abortion? That's not on people's bucket list, right? I mean, so you don't know until you're in that situation whether you're going to need one or not. That's the whole point. And so, and I've tried to gently reflect this back to people, and they can get really upset, but I wouldn't have one. I'm like, I know, right? You're healthy, you're married, you're economically secure. I understand what you're saying. What you're not understanding is that people who are making these decisions aren't those things. And this is part of why they're making this decision. And so it really is reflecting a lack of empathy and compassion when you say something like that, which is the exact opposite of what they're trying to do. So a lot of times in these situations, it's really just helping people unpack and think through what the unintended consequence of what they're saying might be. All right. Given that the vast majority of abortions occur within 16 to 20 weeks, why not compromise with conservative evangelicals regarding laws banning abortions after that time? So abortions after 24 weeks are 0.06% of abortions in the country. They are it's such a small number that any of the rhetoric around late-term abortions, which is a fallacy, so pregnancy is term. That late term, it doesn't mean anything. It's not a medical term. It is a term that has been created to evoke feelings in people. So when people are arguing for these bans, they're trying to ban things that don't happen or exist, or when they do happen, it's for very dire medical emergencies. And so all of that is really functioning to stigmatize abortion and to stigmatize the people having abortions and to imply that these abortions are happening very late. What is actually going to happen is that what has been a very large majority, 89% happen in the first 12 weeks. Those are going to be pushed. We're going to start having much later abortions as people have to get the money, have to figure out how to get to another state. And not only that, in those states, the appointments are backed up. So I've been doing the Abortion and Religion Project now we're into our second year. We did the first year with women in North Carolina, with clinics in North Carolina, and in June we started expanding around the country, doing women having abortions all around the country. I just had someone contact me. Usually they contact me after because they see the poster in the clinic. And she said, I'm scheduled. Her note said she was about to schedule her appointment. And so I texted her back and I said, well, let me know when it's scheduled for. Or I think I even said, have you had it? Because it had been a couple of days. She doesn't have an appointment for another month. I was so upset. This is happening across the country. So again, that is something I think people just are not aware of. Have I spoken to physicians, especially OBGYNs, on how they are challenging anti-abortion laws? A little bit, mostly anecdotally. I did a talk a couple of weeks ago, and there was a woman who is an oncologist there, and she was talking about how she had a patient just the week before who needed chemotherapy and was pregnant with a wanted pregnancy, and she and her staff recommended abortion because she wasn't going to be able to. It was a breast cancer diagnosis that was aggressive, and if she waited until it was safe for her to do the chemo, they didn't know what would happen. And she was really upset and was talking sort of about what was happening, and she was saying, from her perspective, she thought it was going to take OBGYNs in communities across the country just refusing to follow the law and just getting arrested. And then when you have, the beloved doctor who birthed all the babies in the community in prison, people are going to say, what's going on? Now, I'm not sure. My husband's a physician. I'm not sure there are a whole lot of physicians going to sign up to get arrested. But there are a lot of different things happening in different medical communities and conversations. So he's an infectious disease physician, and the Infectious Disease Society of America just passed a statement about 2 weeks ago. And then on his listserv, there were all these conversations among the doctors about, well, should you have done that? Should they have made the statement? And that doesn't reflect all ID doctors. And it was like 3 people. And the rest of the listserv was just like, yeah, it does. So I think these conversations are happening in medical societies among different groups of physicians. I'm not sure, sort of, a lot of questions I often get are sort of, what are pathways to change? I don't know what role physicians have in those pathways to change other than speaking out and telling those stories of their patients. But they are the ones who, right, for the present, they're the ones who are at risk of being imprisoned. Right. I think it will be women soon, and there are women who have been imprisoned as a result of having had abortions. There are a couple that I've been reading about lately, but I think more statutes will be passed that will require that. I think that there's a lot of talk in OBGYN communities. Also did a talk for the students, med students for choice at the University of South Dakota 2 weeks ago. And so and she was like, please come here, help us. Because again, it's probably a state similar to Idaho in terms of the people. And the med students were, debating with each other about, should we be learning these procedures and what happens if they're not teaching them, and how do we get, how do we learn how to do these? So I think those conversations are happening across the spectrum within the medical community. But I think there are a variety of ways that physicians can be involved in helping that public debate and conversation. Thanksgiving is coming. How do we have a civil conversation with our evangelical family members? That's okay. I think I covered this with the how do I talk with my family members. I mean, again, I think it's storytelling. I think it's inviting people into dialogue and saying, look, I want to hear from you, but I want you to hear from me too. And quite frankly, the evangelical discussion around this is so thin that oftentimes if you just ask questions, if you just keep asking questions and you ask them to take the logic of their argument to its conclusion, forced pregnancy, okay, how do you support that biblically? How do you support that theologically, that Christians believe in forced pregnancy? And I think that there are lots of ways that you can do that in simply sort of asking questions with people. Has the Supreme Court decision inadvertently contributed to a more meaningful dialogue on this issue within the church and the community? Possibly. I mean, I think that we were working on the sacred congregation designation for the last 2.5 years, but certainly interest in it has spiked since Dobbs. And I think Planned Parenthood had this survey in, sometime in the fall, but before the memo leaked. And it showed that the majority of Americans didn't think Roe would be overturned. They called it the believability gap, that most people just didn't believe it. And then once the memo was leaked, that flipped right away. But I think there are a lot of Americans who are in shock. And I think that there's been a complacency around allowing these state laws to pass because we had Roe. So before Dobbs, there were a lot of places in the country where women didn't have access to abortion care, where they had to travel long distances. And most of those were very poor women and women with not a lot of access to resources. So I do think it's functioned as a way to wake people up to that extent. Curious about different interpretations of the Torah. This one's yours.
Different interpretations of the Torah, the different translations affect the definition of health. in Judaism, is there, in Jewish tradition, is there a similar sense of patriarchal order? Okay, a lot of questions there. One, so when you read the Torah in its original language, which is to say Hebrew, when you look at a Torah scroll, there are no vowels, so every word is written without vowels. There's no punctuation, so every line could be a statement or it could be a question. There are no capital letters, so you don't know where a sentence would begin or end. As a result, in its original language, Torah is extremely open to interpretation, and every translation is an interpretation. It's not what the original text says, because the original text never says one thing. The original text can always be read many, many ways. It's just the nature of the language and the style in which it's written. Has Torah often been interpreted in a patriarchal manner in the Jewish tradition? Yes, it has for most of Jewish history, when rabbis were all men and the people who were preaching and interpreting Torah in public life were all men. So yeah, that's a legacy that we wrestle with and that we're working on changing. You know, right now in the liberal Jewish world, there are more women being ordained than men. Having women as rabbis and scholars is a game changer, right? I mean, they're just, we were missing, for most of Jewish history, we were missing the wisdom of half of the Jewish people, right? Who wants to work with like half of your brain, you know, with your hands tied behind your back, you know, with half of your brain inaccessible? And that's where we were for most of Jewish history. And in some places in the Orthodox world, they still are. So, you know, we're playing catch up, and we're doing the best that we can, and we're moving forward. I want to say one thing unrelated, just probably, you know, maybe the last thing I have to say, if anybody has, unless somebody has a direct question for me. I'm the father of 3 daughters of childbearing age, and I have told all 3 of them, I don't want you to come to Idaho. I don't want you to come back home. That is incredibly painful for me, because I would love to have my adult daughters living close by, you know? And when there are grandchildren, you know, I'd love them to be around the block from me. But I don't think it's responsible for me to encourage them to come back, because I don't think right now this state is safe for women of childbearing age. That is a painful thing for me to say, and it's a far more painful thing for those of pregnancy, you know, of childbearing age to live with. And I think we, as part of the political debate, so we're talking about the morality, as part of the political conversation, we need to make it clear to people making laws in this state, to our governor, lieutenant governor, to our legislature, that this state is losing creativity. There's a serious brain drain in the state of Idaho because of the intolerance on both abortion, sexuality, I mean, a whole bunch of issues. We're all losing. Our best and our brightest are not staying in this state. The economy, the creativity, we're all losing. You know, when universities are not offering services for their students of childbearing age, when they're not offering services, you know, I'm not going to send my kid to any of those universities. Our universities are going to seriously deteriorate in the quality of students they're getting, in the quality of faculty that they can attract. This is a lose-lose for everybody. The win-win side is we do the right thing, we win. We do the wrong thing, we lose. And right now we're doing the wrong thing.
So that's all of our questions, and I just want to say thank you again. There's more.
There's one more.
In some states which allow abortion rights, the majority of hospitals are in a Catholic hospital system, which does not support abortion procedures. Is there a published safe hospital network so desperate women can end up there for help instead of at a hospital, which won't help them? I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, but it's absolutely the case that there are many, many, many places in the country where people don't have access to health care outside of Catholic hospitals. And that's, it's dangerous. And women have been put at risk. Some of the we have a couple of articles in that book I was telling you about, two in particular about Catholic hospitals. And one talked about how, the physician, the attending physician wanted to do a procedure, an abortion procedure, because of the health of the woman, and, couldn't do it, and, called to transfer the patient, and the person on the other end was like, you need to do this, right? That's your duty as a physician. And they're like, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, we're just going to let her sit here until it gets so bad that we can, right? That her life is at risk. So that's happening across the country all the time. And it's a crisis in healthcare that we have hospital systems that are governed by religious law. And that's a problem. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for the invitation and for coming out tonight. It was great to be with you.
Your attention to the fact that on the back of this, should you be interested, you can scan the QR code and join the All Means All Alliance, which is the group here at Cathedral of the Rockies that put this on tonight. And with that, thank you all for coming and for being a part of this discussion. And we will have discussions in the future, our next one probably in February, and we will let you know.
There's another talk coming in February, and I thought they were mentioning you again as Rabbi Fink.
No.
It's a different one.
It's a different one. Yeah, it'll...
We're getting a little confused.
Now...